The story of Katharine Gordon's impossible dream, which began in 1962, the dream of establishing a symphony in Marshall, Missouri, continues in today's segment. The first season, 1963-64, consisted of one concert directed by Dr. Claude Fitthorn, professor of music at Missouri Valley College, in May of 1964. After that historic concert, accompanied by rave reviews, the future of the symphony seemed assured. The Marshall Democrat News on May 20, 1964 stated, "Marshall and Saline County are indeed fortunate to have such an organization started. It is the hope of all who heard it that this will be but the first of many appearances in the years to come." Two concerts were held in the second concert season, one in December 1964 and one in May 1965. Although Katharine's dream was flourishing in these early years, a change in conductors took place in the fall of 1965. Due to failing health, Dr. Claude Fitthorn had to resign his responsibilities as conductor. His replacement was violinist Harold L. Lickey, thus ushering in 25 years of total commitment to the nurturing and developing of this orchestra, known then as the Philharmonic Society of Saline County. Harold Lickey and Katharine Gordon worked tirelessly throughout the rest of their lives to keep the Philharmonic alive and well. Harold Lickey brought with him a wealth of experience and musical ability. 34 years as a teacher in the Marshall Public School System, most of it as head of its instrumental music department, band and orchestra, and a genuine love for his students. He always called them his kids, no matter how old they were, and a love of music, education, his church, and his community. Mr. Lickey not only had the musical background to be effective in this project, but also had a devoted fan base of students and parents, many of whom eventually performed in the Philharmonic. Several of these students have shared memories for this segment. Betty Westbrook Swisher, one of our charter members of the Philharmonic, and our principal violist until 2005, graduated from Marshall High School in 1941 and was concert mistress in the high school orchestra under Mr. Lickey. Betty and Mr. Lickey always had a special connection because her father, Superintendent W.M. Westbrook, hired Mr. Lickey in 1931 and eventually asked Mr. Lickey to start up a music program. Betty took violin lessons from Mr. Lickey during her grade school and high school years. In her words, "Mr. Lickey was always so patient, kind, and encouraging, but expected the highest quality of performance from us." Ray Blizzard, 1947 Marshall High School graduate, charter member and concert master of the Philharmonic for many years, remembers a particular experience when he was 13 and taking a violin lesson from Mr. Lickey. Ray comments, "Mr. Lickey kept telling me to press down on my bow, and took hold of my arm and pressed down on my fiddle, and broke the hair out of my bow. He said he was sorry, but would replace the bow hair himself." Helen Kofelt, another Marshall High School graduate in 1948, who took lessons from Mr. Lickey from grade school years through high school years, and still plays with the Philharmonic Orchestra, emphasizes the importance of his influence on her life. She states, "I taught music for 34 years and tried to emulate the patience, skill, and untiring time and effort that Mr. Lickey expended to make his students capable musicians. He wanted me to continue playing my cello and told me there would always be a place for me in the Philharmonic." Jane Huff, a 1966 past student of Mr. Lickey's, past president of the Philharmonic and current percussionist for the Philharmonic, wrote about his directing the pit orchestra for the high school musicals. He always wore his Beethoven sweatshirt. Jane said, "Mr. Lickey could convince most of us to try our best in whatever he needed. I had been on the Philharmonic board for many years, but when Betty Trimble Potter, the Philharmonic board president, moved out of town, Mr. Lickey said, 'Jane, I need you to take the position of president. I know you'll do an excellent job. Russell Gann, 1966 Marshall High School graduate, charter member who has performed for 50 consecutive years, and principal cellist, considered Mr. Lickey one of the two most important men who have influenced him, the other being Catherine Gordon. Russell said, "He was my teacher, my mentor, my friend, who instilled in me this tremendous love I have for music even to this day. He introduced me to Bach and Mozart, as well as many other classical composers, and to the cello, the instrument that has allowed me to express my feelings in a way that I never could with words." Cheryl Lines, a 1983 graduate of Marshall High School, was really influenced by Mr. Lickey. She states, "I remember what an honor it was to be invited to play in the orchestra. I usually filled in when there was a need. Mr. Lickey was a disciplinarian and chose difficult and original music of the masters. No watered-down arrangement. He expected the best out of all of us." From 1965 until his death in 1990, Mr. Lickey devoted himself to the Philharmonic and its growth. He stated, "Our strongest asset is our nucleus of local players who just love to play. They want to keep good classical music alive in Marshall. And as a conductor, I try to get music that is of high quality but tuneful enough for our audience. I've always aimed at leaving the audience something they can whistle." By the 70s, Marshall Philharmonic Orchestra was starting to be recognized throughout the nation. In 1974, articles appeared in the Herald Tribune in Sarasota, Florida, Herald Tribune in San Francisco, and many others. The Times-Dispatch in Richmond, Virginia headlined, "Rural Town is Fond of Classical Music." The Kansas City Times also featured the orchestra. One reader and past student of Mr. Lickey's responded that Mr. Lickey passed the ultimate test of a music teacher. The students go on playing through the years. Many talented individuals appeared on the Marshall High School stage during those years. The Halen family, Dr. Walter Halen, his wife Thalia, sons Eric and David, the latter being our soloist today. This family filled out our string sections many times in the late 60s and 70s. Leonora Supan, pianist, graced our stage many times during this decade and into the 80s. She had great respect for Mr. Lickey. Members of the University of Missouri music faculty often appeared, including singers Virginia Pyle, soprano, and Donald Pyle, tenor. Marshall High School graduate and Philharmonic member Philip Bell, contrabass, was featured in 1975. Who could forget 1976 and the bicentennial concert featuring the Federation Singers and sing-along selections? Several DAR members came in costume and acted as hostesses. The Philharmonic Board of Directors was created that same year. Mr. Lickey and Catherine Gordon knew of the importance of having a governing structure for this organization. One of the most important events of the late 70s was the return to the Marshall High School stage of Bob James, a hometown boy and past student of Mr. Lickey's, who was now a professional jazz musician. This was his first appearance on that stage since he graduated from high school in 1957. His respect and love for Mr. Lickey was evident in his willingness to appear many times with the orchestra during the late 70s and 80s. Bob would usually play classical pieces on the piano and then devote the rest of the program to his crossover pieces of jazz and rock. Each performance was to a packed auditorium. Mr. Lickey would often comment, "I can remember that when Bob was just a little boy, you could put him in another room and then play one of the most discordant chords, and he could tell you each one of those notes. It got to be a game." That game became Bob's profession. By 1978, the Philharmonic was celebrating its 16th birthday, replete with balloons and cake. This was a historic moment for this organization. The mining of local talent was always important to Mr. Lickey, as evidenced by his selection of soloists over the years. In 1979, Lyle King, professor of music at Missouri Valley College, and his wife Charlene were featured vocalists, accompanied by Betty Swisher on piano and Mary Lou Porter flute. Ann Nepchild was featured on oboe that year while she was a student at the University of Missouri. She had performed with the orchestra throughout high school and college and would return as soloist several times in the next few years. Dr. James Reed, charter member and concert master, would retire and leave the community. He was famous for leaving a performance to deliver a baby during one of the early concerts and then returning after intermission to finish the performance. Katherine Gordon and Mr. Lickey always felt the importance of having professional individuals and groups appear as often as was possible. The St. Louis Symphony and the Kansas City Symphony made several appearances over the 50-year period. The decade of the 80s marked the pinnacle of Mr. Lickey's career, beginning with the appearance on the Marshall High School stage of Myron Florin, the accordionist for the Lawrence Welk television show. Mr. Lickey had worked for 2 years to get this particular performer to Marshall. What a great event! The town was buzzing and could hardly wait for this concert to happen. Myron Florin in Marshall. The performance became even more exciting when we learned that Myron's clothes and accordion were stolen soon after he arrived in Kansas City, necessitating his borrowing an accordion in the city and arriving in the only clothes he had with him. When he arrived in Marshall, he found out that a man by the name of Walter Keith was also an accordionist, had the exact type of accordion that Myron had, and was more than willing for Myron to use that accordion. During the performance, the strap broke on Walter's accordion, so Myron went backstage, took the strap off the borrowed accordion from the city, returned to the stage, and finished the concert. The auditorium was overflowing with his fans and will always be remembered as one of the favorite events of the orchestra. He would return later in the 80s to the same enthusiastic crowd and perform with Walter Keith and other accordion players. During the early 80s, Mr. Lickey started the Grand Piano Fund. He knew that the orchestra needed its own grand piano for its own use and for future soloists. By the end of 1981, the money was raised and the piano dedicated with a recital by Leonora Suppan. Walter and Thalia Halen were featured soloists that year. In 1981, the Philharmonic Flute section was featured, Mary Lou Porter and Charles Farmer. 1982 saw the return of Bob James, this time performing with his wife Judy and his daughter Hillary. Standing room only crowd. Carol Lowry, bassoonist for the orchestra at that time, was one of the featured performers. She played with the orchestra for several years and then moved away. But she came back to play with the orchestra for the first concert of this 50th season. Each season of the 80s held such promise for all involved. In February of 1983, the Marshall Suzuki Kids were showcased. The future of the orchestra was seen in those students, many of them playing in the orchestra throughout middle school and high school. The Suzuki program was started by Paul Rowland in 1975 and later carried on by Julie Reed, the teacher of this particular group. Julie Carton, Connie Bake, Sandra Bake, Susan Eilers, Julie Jensen, Trey Elsie, Heidi Schilb, Liz Huff, Lindsay Wilson, and Christy Hurd made up this talented group of young people. 1983 also celebrated the return of Bob James, this time Bob composing a special piece for the April concert, Work on Scales, for oboe and chamber orchestra. Bob dedicated this piece to his piano teacher, Mrs. Mamie Dufford. The soloists for this concert were Mrs. Dufford's family, her daughter, Catherine Dufford Palu, and past student of Mr. Lickey's on oboe, her son-in-law, Norman Palu, on violin, and her granddaughter, Laura Palu, on flute. Each individual was a professional musician. Thomas Yancey, and former student of Mr. Lickey's, Marshall native, was a featured pianist during this year. 1984-85 was filled with the appearance of Mary Westbrook Yeh, mezzo-soprano. She was getting ready for her Carnegie Hall performance in Handel's Messiah. She was Mr. Lickey's student and Betty Swisher's niece. The hometown connection has always been part of the programming, as was shown by the many performances of Handel's Messiah and Marshall, usually featuring talented singers of the community. Bob James returns bringing a friend, Alexander Zanjek, classical, jazz, and pop flutist. Gene Gaddy Wilson wrote a review for the Marshall Democrat News of that concert in May 1985. It was a day that celebrated a man, his music, his mentor, his friend, his father, his sister, and all of us. And shining throughout all of these performances was the modest, humble Renaissance man, the watchmaker, bicyclist, conductor, as portrayed on the 1985 NBC's American Almanac series as the music man, Harold L. Lickey. When Mr. Lickey received word that a new program on NBC called American Almanac was interested in featuring the Marshall Philharmonic Orchestra, he felt it was too good to be true. A past board member, Gene Gaddy Wilson, had friends at NBC and mentioned that the Philharmonic would be a good story. Marshall and the Philharmonic were in the headlines again, and now on television. The opening concert of the 1985-86 season was the chosen concert to be filmed. 3 soloists were chosen, 2 from the orchestra and 1 from the community. Betty Swisher, soprano, Julie Evans Lewis, piano, and Charles Farmer, flute. Each individual practiced very hard and felt quite nervous with all the cameras and the lights on them the day of the performance. Betty Swisher remembers looking forward to the television show. I could hardly wait to see how we all came across. Unfortunately, all of the soloists ended up on the cutting room floor. However, it was an exciting event. Mr. Lickey and the Philharmonic had its moment of fame, which lasted for quite some time. He said, "I think it will give our town a little more prestige rather than just importing an artist." He was interviewed by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in March of 1986, the maestro of Marshall, Missouri. As described by the article, on this particular afternoon, he was wearing a plaid shirt, dark corduroy pants, and a navy cardigan sweater. A red and blue tie was held in place with a spiffy gold clip of musical notes. He radiates an air of peacefulness as he speaks, poised in an easy chair with his violin resting on his lap. His thin white hair has receded high above his forehead, and gold wire-rimmed spectacles sit erect on his nose. He has a soothing, soft voice and a delicate manner. At times, his hands fly up to illustrate a point. Otherwise, they remain fixed to the arms of his chair. If anyone today asks a veteran player what he or she remembers about Mr. Lickey, the description by the St. Louis paper is the image that is familiar. But we all remember his directing and enunciating the beat by saying, "Deedle deedle, deedle deedle, deedle deedle, deedle deedle." The latter 80s were full of exciting events and seasons. Ann Nepchild heads the fall of 1986, returning this time with her doctorate in music. Another hometown student of Mr. Lickey's who has made music her life. This concert was dedicated to the memory of Catherine Gordon, who had passed away on October 29, 1986. He founded, financed, and performed with the orchestra for many years. That same season saw the return of more of Marshall's young talent. Sandra Bake, piano, Heidi Schell, piano, Lindsay Wilson, violin, and Kevin Klinkenberg, violin. The 3 young ladies had previously been featured as part of the Suzuki program. Not only were the concerts full of local talent, but also presented a professional look for the orchestra on stage. Men in tuxes and women in black formal wear. Mrs. Lickey had requested for many years that the whole orchestra dress in black. In addition, a county-wide contest was created to see who could design a logo for the orchestra that would appear on letterheads, posters, programs, t-shirts, and bumper stickers. Shirley McKay won the contest, and her logo has been used since that time. The silver anniversary celebration took place in 1987-88, featuring Bob James and Alexander Zanjek, Marshall High School singers with Connie Bake and cello, another Suzuki student, and ending with Leonora Supan. Again, Mr. Lickey and the orchestra were featured on a segment entitled Culture in America on Sunday Today, another NBC program. At age 79, Mr. Lickey was asked to be a guest conductor for the St. Louis Symphony on July 1st, 1988, the highlight of his career, according to his wife, Viva. According to her, he wanted to experience conducting a professional orchestra where the players could actually play all of the notes. His career was marked by many proud moments in directing the Marshall Philharmonic Orchestra for 25 years, and ensuring its future was a major portion of his legacy as the music man of Marshall. The last season Harold Lickey would direct was the 1988-89 one. The programs of that season showcased a variety of artists ranging from Dr. Neil Sipe, trumpet, Douglas Roth, harpist, to Russell Gann, cellist, and the Sedalia Community Chorus. At intermission of the April 1989 concert, Mr. Lickey walked off the stage after having suffered a heart attack. The music man passed away in October of 1990, leaving a wonderful legacy to the Marshall community and to each individual with whom he came into contact. The legacy that both Catherine Gordon and Harold Lickey left to this community would not have been possible without the support and dedication of their wives, Elaine Gordon and Viva Lickey. We leave you with this clipping from the 1985 American Almanac segment and the vision of Harold L. Lickey that we all remember.
Mr. Music, but he's never tapped his baton on the podiums of the great orchestras of London or New York. He's never conducted anything but the Marshall, Missouri Philharmonic Orchestra. Somehow there is a wonderful harmony here. He may not be Leonard Bernstein or Toscanini, but Harold Lickey is someone you won't forget. Somehow there is a wonderful harmony here. He may not be Leonard Bernstein or Toscanini, but Harold Lickey is someone you won't forget.
Jack Severson has that story next on American Almanac. Something so special that even for a moment or two it will bring pride and joy to those we care about and to ourselves. As Jack Severson reports, Harold Lickey has done a little better than just a moment or two of pride and joy. It was 23 years ago that Harold Lickey decided to give his small town something it was missing. We'll give you a hint. Harold Lickey is a music man.
And rehearsing, the 23rd season of the Marshall Philharmonic is ready to begin. This is not the most important day in Marshall, but there is always an air of excitement. During one of these concerts, the violinist beeper went off. He was a town obstetrician, dashed out and delivered a healthy baby, came back after the intermission, and nobody even suspected what had happened. And so, ladies and gentlemen, the season premiere of the Marshall Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Maestro Harold Lickey. Do you worry? Do you wonder about what happens when you're gone?
A little, yeah. I hope to remember it even in my will.
The orchestra.
Yeah.
I gotta feel they're gonna remember you too, you know.